My name is Patrick Kennedy, and I'm going to be speaking today about satire, cynicism, and American politics. As you all know, we live in a country that values and protects free speech and an uncensored media, and therefore I think it's really hardly surprising that political satire has been embedded in our country's political culture more or less since its founding. To give a couple of my favorite historical examples here, Mark Twain once said, quote, "It could probably be shown with facts and figures that there is no distinctly Native American criminal class except for Congress." Larry Hardiman, in a similar vein, once said, "The word politics is derived from the word poly, meaning many, and the word ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites." Right. So today, this tradition of cynical satire continues through the works of such comedians as Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, Conan O'Brien, Bill Maher, and also such shows as Saturday Night Live, South Park, The Simpsons. All these programs regularly incorporate politically oriented material into their screenwriting. According to the Nielsen Media Research Company, millions of viewers tune in to watch these programs every week. And even more strikingly, according to a 2008 Pew Research Center poll, fully 23% of young adults aged 18 to 30 report receiving most or all of their information about current events and politics from fake news shows like The Daily Show. So recognizing that there's certainly some truth to the common expression that information is power, I think it's really important that we pay attention to the way that comedians wield the capacity to influence and shape political opinion through their work. So the purpose of this presentation, then, is to examine the relationship between comedians, elected officials, and citizens. In particular, I'm going to examine some of the positive effects of political humor in promoting democratic values, but then also scrutinize some of its possible negative implications for things like civic participation and trust in government. Ultimately, I'm hoping to reconcile these two views and draw some sort of conclusion about the extent to which we can say political satire is healthy or unhealthy for American democratic culture. So just very briefly, I'd like to dwell for a moment on the idea of cynical satire and explicate a little bit what I mean by that. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the notion that politicians are corrupt, lying, cheating, flip-flopping, unprincipled, scum-of-the-earth type people. And this is exactly the stereotype that I'm referring to when I say cynical satire. And I just very briefly like to show a video clip from The Daily Show with Jon Stewart that I think really captures this stereotype quite well. Here we go. In this episode, Jon Stewart is going to be criticizing John McCain for flip-flopping on a bunch of public issues, and he thinks this flip-flop really takes the cake right here.
Senator McCain said something that I found rather striking over the weekend. He gave an interview to Newsweek magazine, and he said, quote, "I never considered myself a maverick."
I'll give you a moment to scrape your brains off the ceiling. Now, normally this is obviously where we talk to a montage of John McCain calling himself a maverick, but I don't even need to. That's how embedded the word maverick is on his persona. Be like Rudy Giuliani coming out. I never mentioned 9/11. I don't know about it. It's like I can't believe it's not butter saying, I never believed I was butter. Why would I believe that? I never believed it. It's on the container.
Great. So I thought that very nicely captured just the idea that politicians are flip-flopping all the time. Jon Stewart titled that clip "Say Anything," and I think it's very clear his implication is that politicians are quite literally willing to do or say anything if it helps them to maintain their hold on political power. So moving on then, in what ways might this brand of humor actually strengthen our democracy? Oh, uh-oh. That's quite all right. Well, as any Native American will tell you, we really do have good reasons to be skeptical of the government and to challenge officials in positions of political authority. One scholar, Robert Harriman, argues in an influential essay that satire is, quote, "essential for an engaged, sustainable, democratic public culture." And one aspect of Harriman's theory in particular that I want to emphasize is this idea of leveling, which is the idea that political satire somehow serves to mitigate perceived disparities between political and social groups across society. So applying that concept to the Daily Show clip we just saw, Robert Harriman might say that this Jon Stewart's humor there provides a public good because he's emphasizing the fact that just because Jon Stewart is a powerful, influential congressional senator, he's still not immune to the critical condemnation of a comedian who's really just pretending to be a news anchor. He's not even really a news anchor. So the idea is that this helps to corroborate this ideal that we're all moral equals in democratic society. Another scholar, Kristen Heflin, argues that political satirists fulfill the role of vigilant media watchdogs. They scrutinize the incompetence, or sometimes the competence, of government and censure the media for failing to do the same. And she says, quote, "By exposing the way political messages are constructed and showing them as manipulated versions of factual information, The Daily Show criticizes the politicians and political institutions that perpetuate this behavior." So what I think Kristen Heflin is hoping for here is that if voters are more educated to be skeptical of political officials, they can do a better job of holding them accountable for their actions, either through public policy or perhaps even just by voting them out at the next election. So to a certain extent then, the suspicion of governmental authority is a healthy symptom of free institutions and a robust public debate. I think, however, it's important to recognize that the prevalence of this kind of skepticism also runs the risk of undeservedly vilifying our political leaders. So you're probably wondering why there's a broken eggshell on my AV. I'll get to that in just a moment. A very important study by political scientists Jacobs and Shapiro suggests that politicians may actually deserve a lot more credit than we give them. While the conventional wisdom may say, as Jon Stewart does, that politicians are willing to do or say anything to keep their jobs, Jacobs and Shapiro, in their empirical study, find that politicians actually expend vast amounts of time and money trying to convince their constituents to support their preferred policy initiatives. Or in other words, they try and convince voters to support them in doing what they think is right. Furthermore, they find that only when these politicians fail to convince their constituents do they violate their own consciences and in fact vote in line with public opinion. So the important thing to take away from this then is that there are, arguably that's the way our democracy was designed to function, that politicians were meant to represent citizens' preferences rather than necessarily enact what they think is right. So the reason I have an eggshell up there then is because there's a very common expression that if you want to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. And it doesn't always seem clear that politicians, or voters in particular, are willing to be the ones to break their eggs. So another argument that kind of supports this comes from Richard Fenno, who's also a political scientist. He's famously identified what's come to be known as Fenno's paradox. And what Fenno's paradox says is that although citizens theoretically insist that all members of Congress should be fair and impartial and principled, in practice, they also expect preferential treatment from their own representatives. So in other words, what this suggests is that citizens want politicians to be principled, but only if those principles match their own preferences. So once again, we have this issue of everybody wants their own, but they don't want to sacrifice. They want other people to sacrifice. So a further deleterious effect comes from the research of Jonathan Morris, who conducted a study showing that young adults who watch The Daily Show are much more likely than others to view political leaders as negative, with negative connotations attached to that. So rather than inspiring change in society, as Kristen Heflin earlier suggested, this study suggests that political satire might simply just erode our confidence in public institutions and really just encourage young voters to perhaps abandon the ballot box altogether. And indeed, the National Elections Studies Organization reported in 2004 that youngest voters are, of course, the least likely to vote, which is not to imply causation, but there is indeed very strong correlation then between The Daily Show's strongest demographic and also between the least likely to vote group. So in conclusion then, I just want to argue that while political satire serves an important democratic function in promoting a healthy skepticism of government, it may also ironically perpetuate the status quo. In particular, satire that criticizes the moral character of individual politicians oftentimes overlooks the institutional constraints that motivates their behavior in the first place. So in addition to embracing a healthy skepticism of political authority, I suggest that we should also adopt a similar sort of skepticism toward political comedians. Their jokes often dramatically understate the multifaceted of issues facing our elected leaders, and we should be wary of these blanket stereotypes that elected officials are somehow morally deficient in some way. And we should work to distinguish institutional political trends from personal ones. Only then will political satire retain its capacity to inspire change and reform in our democratic culture. Thank you.